Hello, everybody. Hope everybody is doing well. I know this is a rough time right now with a lot of uncertainty going on, so I hope everybody's doing okay. If you have any issues with anything, please don't hesitate to email me or any of the staff or administration at the school. We are definitely here to help anybody try to get through this time. So I do want to briefly talk about the AP test. The College Board released a statement this week saying that they are planning to go ahead with AP testing in May. They may push that back depending upon how long we end up being out of school. They also are talking about some other options for AP testing, but long story short, they are planning to do AP testing this year. So we do have 4 more chapters that we need to cover to make sure that you all are ready for the AP test. So I'm going to try to get through those in the next 3 or 4 weeks to make sure that you guys are as ready as possible for that test. So this chapter is going to go over interest groups, which we've obviously talked a lot about this year. So hopefully this is a fairly easy chapter for everybody. You will be asked to talk about your interest group in a lot of detail. That's one of the things that I think can help you for the AP test, is to know your interest group really well. So if they were to ask you questions on an extended response pertaining to interest groups, you'd be able to kind of reference that. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to just do a kind of an overview of the chapter, just a little bit of how interest groups differ in the United States versus European countries, as well as some of the background for the way interest groups work and the function and the different types of interest groups that exist. So I'm going to be kind of walking through the PowerPoint. I'll try to do this as quickly as possible each day to try to get through the material in 10-12 minutes for you, and then kind of send you on to some other things. So big learning objectives for this chapter. We're going to talk about how interest groups really came about in the United States, when we really started to see the rise of interest groups, particularly after the Civil War into the early 1900s to the Progressive Era. We'll kind of walk through a little bit of that history. We're going to look at the 2 different types of interest groups that represent either groups of individuals or individuals themselves, and how political action committees and the growth of government has really given rise to new interest groups. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about some incentives that people have for joining interest groups as to why someone might want to give their money to a group, particularly if that group is going to be advocating in their interests anyway. So if you look at groups like the Sierra Club or the NRA that are really focused on singular issues, a lot of people, if they care about those issues, those groups are going to be advocating for them anyway. So what are the incentives that draw people to join those groups? We're also going to be looking at the issue of government regulation and the things that government does or doesn't do to regulate interest groups. And then we're going to talk about the link between interest groups and political action committees. And this is probably the most important thing in this chapter, is to make sure that you don't mix up those terms, is that interest groups have a lobbying role, political action committees have a campaign finance role. So we'll talk about the difference of that as we go through. And then we'll kind of look at regulation and the types of things that Congress does or doesn't do to regulate interest groups. So just as an introduction, you already know this obviously since you've been looking at an interest group for part of the year. An interest group is any group that seeks to influence public policy through their belief in a common goal. And we've really seen a really sharp rise in the number of interest groups in the United States, particularly since the Cold War. And really that's due in part to the growth of government. We've added quite a few cabinet departments during that time. Government brings in and spends a lot more money today than we've done in the past. So those interest groups seek to lobby government as to how they spend that money and to try to get a cut of that money for their members or their members' interests. So obviously, interest groups are very, very powerful in Washington, D.C. When we get to Chapter 15, we'll talk about what's known as the Iron Triangle, which kind of relates how government works and the links between different groups in Washington. But one of the things we've seen, particularly over the last 10 years or so, is a huge growth in the number of full-time lobbyists in Washington, D.C. There are thousands of people who work in Washington, D.C. for various interest groups whose full-time job it is just to go door-to-door lobbying members of Congress. So that is a very lucrative business today. today. There's a lot of people who are engaged in that activity. The book at the beginning of this chapter really kind of walks through the history of interest groups. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because you can read through this in the book. But really, we saw kind of the rise of interest groups in the U.S. in the 1830s and 40s. And these were religious groups who were seeking different influences in government. Obviously, at that time, we talked about the fact that government did fund religious schools, did spend money on different religious organizations. And those groups were really trying to seek influence with government as to how they were going to spend that money. Obviously, as we moved towards the Civil War, we started to see the rise of some anti-slavery groups. And then after the Civil War, we saw our first economic interest groups, in which we really saw interest groups related to the rise of farming. You may have talked about the Grange in U.S. history last year. That was a group of people who advocated for the interests of farmers. And then when we moved into the 1880s, we started to see the growth of some of our business interests. And that was a significant growth that we saw there in terms of just the shifting of the American economy. And as the economy changed, interest groups changed along with it. Moving into the 1900s, we started to see the growth of some of our more business-oriented groups that represented groups of people. So the Chamber of Commerce, the American Medical Association, and groups like that really started to grow in prominence. Now, more recently, what we've seen is since the 1960s, as we really saw the rise of some of our environmental groups. It was the environmental lobby which led to the creation of the EPA during the Nixon administration that really lobbied government to make changes in government regulation of the environment. So that was a significant change. And in the 1970s, Congress made it possible for interest groups to establish political action committees, or PACs, and that really changed the scope of what interest groups can do, and that now the interest groups can lobby, not just lobby members of Congress, but they can also donate money to congressional campaigns and things like that. And the Supreme Court case we talked about earlier this year of Buckley versus Vallejo really kind of laid the ground as our first campaign finance case, as it talked about hard and soft money and things like that, and really kind of for the first time addressed this issue of political action committees. So just to briefly summarize that again, political action committees, any group that's set up not just by an interest group, but by a business or a union whose goal it is to raise money and spend that money on political campaigns. Now, I want to note one word here that I really want you to pay attention to in the definition of a PAC, and that's the word voluntary donations, is that donations cannot be forced. If you are a member of a union, oftentimes with union dues, depending upon the type of union that you may be in, a portion of your union dues go to lobbying, and union members can sometimes opt out of paying that money if they don't support whatever the union happens to be lobbying. So political action committees utilize voluntary donations for members. Now, certain interest groups are a little bit different. If you join the NRA, if you join the Sierra Club, you basically, by joining, are consenting to them using some of that money for lobbying purposes and to use for their political action committee and trying to donate that money to members of Congress. So political action committees obviously have seen a huge rise since the 1970s when they were created. Today we have well over 4,000 political action committees. Most are ideological in nature, and what I mean by that is that they advocate some sort of political ideology. They're very conservative groups, very liberal groups, or whatever the case may be. Now, the book talks about back in 2014, when this book was written, there were over 14,000 full-time lobbyists working in Washington, D.C., working for various interest groups or businesses or unions, and those groups spent about $3.5 billion on campaigns over that period of time. So that's obviously a significant amount of money that was spent on campaigns to lobby members of Congress for various things. So political action committees, through interest groups, have a significant amount of power in our government today. Now, how are we different from Europe? The big difference between the U.S. and Europe, obviously, is that our government here is incredibly decentralized. In the United States, with our federal system, we have people at the federal level, the state level, the local level, and interest groups seek to lobby all of them, is that they can make change on various issues at any level of government. Where in many European nations, everything is very much top-down, is that they don't have this federal system. Everything is dictated from the federal government. And obviously, when we talked earlier this year about how parliamentary elections are different in European countries, in some countries where you're voting for the party instead of a person, there's no primary elections in certain countries, so there's not as much influence that a group could have on an individual member of parliament like you can have in the United States with individual members of Congress or a state legislature or a governor or something like that. So in the United States, there are a lot more interest groups than there are in Europe, and they're a lot more powerful. And those interest groups oftentimes are really able to kind of dictate in certain ways the way members of Congress might act, the way different state legislatures may act. Now, one of the things that we see in some of our European countries as well is because the way that they do their elections, they're not winner take all like we have in the United States, is that if a party gets 2 or 3% of the vote, they get 2 or 3% of the seats in parliament. So if you have, for instance, an environmental interest group in Europe, that group may form a political party, may be able to gain a handful of seats in a legislature, where in the United States, a third party really doesn't have much of a chance to really gain any seats. So you don't see that kind of blending between interest groups and political parties like you would see in some of our European countries. So a big difference between the U.S. and Europe there. So just note, way more interest groups in the United States than there are in Europe, and it's mainly because of how decentralized our government really is. Now, the book talks about a lot of reasons why we've seen a huge increase in interest groups, and I'm just going to kind of summarize these four, and they kind of fall into four categories here: what we call broad economic developments, changes in government policy, leadership of these interest groups, and then increased governmental activity. And we'll kind of walk through the four of those, and that'll kind of be the last thing we talk about for today. Now, when I talk about broad economic developments, what I'm talking about here is that the economy in the United States has changed, and it's changed a lot over time. And every time the economy changes, there are groups of people who either resist that change. You might be in an industry that's struggling to hang on. If you look at the automobile industry today, manufacturing in the United States that has struggled a little bit recently. It could be farming back in the 1800s into the 1900s when we started to see industrialization, things like that. And we see groups that advocate for their issues, and we see a lot of interest groups form around new economic topics. So when a new economic industry may form, industries expand. Obviously, when we saw industrialization, we saw the rise of unions. Those all lead to new interest groups, and those interest groups are really seeking to advocate in the interest of their members. Now, some of those interest groups kind of wane in power over time. If you look at private sector unions, very, very powerful 50, 60 years ago, not nearly as powerful today. Now, they're still powerful in some industries. Across the board, not as much. Private sector union membership has decreased significantly in the United States, in part because a lot of those union jobs are not here anymore. Either they've shifted to southern states, which with right to work laws are more anti-union, or that they've shifted overseas. So a lot of those union jobs have disappeared. But one of the things we see when the economy changes, interest groups tend to form to either resist that or to kind of take advantage of those new growth opportunities. The second thing the book talks about that leads to the rise in interest groups is changes in government policy. Whenever government does anything, interest groups tend to form. So if you look at a war that the United States might get into, a war creates veterans, and we have all sorts of veterans interest groups in the United States that lobby for the interests of veterans. Interest groups also have a significant role in licensing in the United States. If you look at the role the American Medical Association plays in the licensing of doctors and things like that in the United States, they basically determine the skills that you need to be a doctor, a lawyer, things like that in the United States. So these interest groups have a significant role that they play in our government policy and those issues. So again, interest groups, depending upon the industry, government takes a lot of credence in what those groups say, and they will listen to those groups pretty strongly on a lot of different issues. The third is leadership. One big reason that certain interest groups have power is that they have strong leaders, and oftentimes those leaders are able to drive those interest groups in a strong direction. If you look at someone like Ralph Nader and his role in automobile safety, and I know we've talked about him a couple times this year, when you have somebody who's passionate about an issue and who's really able to make something personal in terms of advocating for an issue, that's going to have a lot more pull with members of Congress or with the American public than if some other person might happen to say that. So if you look at some of our strong leaders with some of these interest groups, whether it be our anti-slavery groups around the time of the Civil War, whether it be our civil rights groups that we saw through the 50s and 60s, strong leaders oftentimes drive those interest groups into having maybe a little bit more power than they might have otherwise with our Congress. And then finally, increase government activity. Obviously, the bigger government is, the more room there is for interest groups to exist. And I don't think there's any thing that really drives this home any more than the creation of new cabinet departments. Obviously, the most recent cabinet department is the Department of Homeland Security, which we created back in 2001. When the Department of Homeland Security was created, we consolidated a lot of other pieces from a lot of different agencies, but we also created a lot of new agencies. And when those new agencies were created and our government set aside billions of dollars worth of funding, interest groups just emerged to try to influence government how they should spend that money. So obviously, when our government gets bigger, and it's been growing significantly over the last 100 years, new interest groups kind of emerge along that. Interest groups emerge as well to address issues that impact us as American citizens. So whether it be the creation of the EPA, which was really driven by interest groups in the 1960s and early 70s, consumer financial protection, which you may know Elizabeth Warren was involved with the creation of that agency, but that was very much interest group driven to kind of resist the banks and some of the things that they did to kind of take advantage of American citizens during the financial collapse of the 2000s. But again, government gets bigger, and oftentimes they get bigger because interest groups drive issues, but in other cases, interest groups may emerge as government gets bigger. So all of those are reasons why interest groups in this country grow, and they really are taking on more of a significant role in our government today, and particularly over the last 20 or 30 years, since we've created political action committees, than they did at any point before that. Now, I want to wrap up today with your writing prompts. So this is to kind of show that you have gone through the activities today. Today's writing prompt really has to do with the issue of political action committees and their role. So I want you to kind of revisit the Supreme Court case of Citizens United. So for today's writing prompt, if you could please address for me the 5 key parts of the McCain-Feingold Act that were passed back in the 2000s, and then the role that Citizens United played in either upholding or striking down some of those components. So if you could list out those 5 components of McCain-Feingold and then discuss, and specifically tell me what they are. So don't just give me terms. Make sure you can explain things for me. And then talk about the parts of that were struck down or parts that were upheld in Citizens United. So that'll be it for today. Tomorrow, please check back here as well. We'll have another video up for you for tomorrow. I hope everybody has a great day, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.